Love, as human beings experience it, is never still. To love is to be moved. To love is to be affected. To love is to respond to another. When someone we love suffers, something happens to us. When someone we love rejoices, something in us shifts. But classical theism tells us something very different about God. God does not change. God cannot be affected. God remains eternally the same. So here is the quiet question that follows. If God is immutable, can God truly love? Or does divine love mean something so different that the word itself begins to stretch? Intro. If God is immutable, can God truly love? Within the history of classical theism, few claims are as central or as carefully defended as the claim that God is immutable. Immutability is not a side detail. It is a cornerstone. God does not change because God is perfect. Change implies movement. Movement implies lack. Lack implies imperfection. Therefore, God must be beyond change. At the same time, theism insists with equal confidence that God loves. Not merely that God performs loving actions, but that God is love itself. These two claims sit at the heart of the tradition. God is immutable. God is love. This video does not ask whether God exists. It does not argue that God cannot love. Instead, it asks something quieter and more internal. What happens when these two claims are held together without compromise? What assumptions are required to make them compatible? And what tensions quietly emerge when we take both seriously? Part 1. The theistic claim. The classical theistic claim begins with metaphysics, not emotion. God is not a being among beings. God is not one thing within the universe that reacts to other things. God is the fullness of being itself. Pure actuality, without unrealized potential. In this framework, change is not neutral. Change always involves moving from what could be to what is. A seed becomes a tree. Ignorance becomes knowledge. Loneliness becomes love. Each change reveals a prior lack. But God, classical theism insists, lacks nothing. If God could change, God would either gain something or lose something. Both options imply imperfection. Therefore, God must be immutable. This immutability is not meant to make God distant. It is meant to protect divine perfection. God does not improve. God does not deteriorate. God does not fluctuate emotionally. God eternally is what God is. Within this framework, divine love must also be understood differently. God does not fall in love. God does not grow in love. God does not love more today than yesterday. God loves eternally, fully, and without variation. From the divine perspective, nothing new ever happens. This is not a mistake or oversight. It is the logical consequence of a certain vision of perfection. And for centuries, this vision has been regarded as philosophically necessary. Part 2. The hidden assumption. Behind this claim lies an assumption rarely stated directly. That love does not require being affected by the beloved. That love can be fully real without vulnerability. Without emotional movement. Without relational change. Human love does not function this way. To love another person is to allow their existence to matter to us in a way that costs something. Their pain hurts us. Their absence leaves a mark. Their rejection wounds. Love exposes us to change. Yet when speaking of God, the tradition insists that divine love must be different. God loves without being moved. God cares without being affected. God wills the good without responding to events in time. The assumption is subtle. That love is fundamentally an act of will, not an experience of relation. That love is something one does, not something that happens to someone. In human terms, this distinction collapses. We do not separate loving from being affected. The two belong together. But in classical theism, they are carefully separated. God loves, but nothing happens to God as a result. This raises a quiet but important question. If love never involves being affected, in what sense is it still relational? Part 3. The internal tension. This is where the tension becomes visible. If God cannot be affected, then suffering does not change God. History does not alter God. Prayer does not move God. Everything that happens in time is already eternally present to God. From the divine perspective, there is no before and after. No waiting. No surprise. When a child cries out in pain, nothing new occurs in God. When a prayer is spoken in desperation, nothing shifts in God. God eternally wills the good, but nothing ever happens to God in response. So what does it mean to say that God loves this particular person in this particular moment? Is divine love a lived relationship or an eternal stance? If God's love toward all creatures is eternally identical, what distinguishes love for one from love for another? The tradition often responds by saying that the difference lies not in God, but in us. We change. We receive love differently. God remains the same. But this response carries a cost. It suggests that love is something entirely on one side of the relationship. God gives. Creatures receive. Nothing flows back. In human relationships, such a structure would not be called love. It would be called control, benevolence, or management. Yet divine love is said to be more real, not less. The question is whether immutability allows for that depth. Part 4. Closely connected to immutability is the doctrine of divine impassibility. God does not suffer. God does not experience emotional disturbance. God cannot be wounded. This doctrine was developed to protect God from being overwhelmed by the chaos of creation. If God could suffer, then God would be vulnerable. If God were vulnerable, then God might be diminished. So impassibility safeguards divine transcendence. But it also sharpens the tension. Love, as humans understand it, involves the possibility of suffering. To love is to risk pain. To care is to open oneself to loss. If God cannot suffer, can God love in this sense? The tradition often replies that God's love is so perfect that it does not require suffering. God wills the good without emotional cost. But this response shifts love away from lived relation and toward abstract benevolence. It begins to sound less like love as experienced and more like eternal approval. This does not refute divine love, but it does transform it into something unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity raises further questions. Part 5. Prayer and Relationality. Prayer intensifies the tension. Believers are invited to speak to God, to ask, to plead, to hope for response. Yet if God is immutable, prayer does not change God. The outcome of prayer is eternally known and eternally willed. Nothing new is introduced into the divine life. From the human perspective, prayer feels relational. From the divine perspective, nothing shifts. So what exactly is prayer doing? Is prayer a genuine interaction or a participation in a fixed eternal plan? The tradition often says that prayer changes us, not God. That may be true, but it leaves the relational asymmetry intact. In human relationships, communication matters because it affects both sides. In divine relations, communication seems to affect only one. This does not make prayer meaningless, but it alters its character. Prayer becomes alignment, not dialogue. And that shift quietly reshapes what love looks like. Part 6. Incarnation and the Problem of Change. The doctrine of incarnation is often offered as a solution. God enters history. God experiences human life. God suffers in the flesh. But classical theology carefully limits what this means. The divine nature does not change. Only the human nature suffers. God experiences suffering through the humanity of Christ, not in the divine essence. This preserves immutability. But it also reinforces the separation. God appears to suffer without suffering. God appears to be affected without being affected. The incarnation reveals love, but without compromising immutability. This solution is theologically elegant. Yet it raises another quiet question. If love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is confined to a created nature, where does divine love truly reside? Is love located in the unchanging divine essence or in the changing human experience? The tradition answers both. But holding both together requires careful balance. And that balance carries philosophical weight. Part 7. Time, Eternity, and Relation. At the heart of this issue lies the concept of time. Human love unfolds in time. It grows. It deepens. It responds. Divine love is eternal. It does not unfold. It does not develop. Everything is present at once. From this perspective, God does not wait for us. God does not anticipate. God does not remember. All moments are equally present. This eternal simultaneity protects divine perfection. But it distances divine love from human experience. Love that never waits is not patient. Love that never anticipates is not hopeful. Love that never remembers is not nostalgic. These qualities are central to human love. The question is whether divine love can lack them without losing something essential. Part 8. Personality and Change. Personhood, as humans understand it, involves change. We grow. We learn. We are shaped by relationships. A person who cannot be affected by others begins to resemble a principle rather than a presence. Classical theism resists this conclusion. God is personal, but not a person in the human sense. This distinction matters. But it also raises the question of what personal love means without mutual influence. Can a relationship be personal if only one side is capable of change? The tradition answers yes. But the cost of that answer is a redefinition of personhood itself. Divine personality becomes something fundamentally unlike human personality. Again, this is not incoherent. But it is tension-filled. Part 9. Modern Sensibilities and Ancient Metaphysics. Modern believers often imagine God emotionally. A God who rejoices. A God who grieves. A God who responds. These images are powerful because they resonate with lived experience. But they sit uneasily with classical immutability. The more emotionally responsive God becomes, the more metaphysically vulnerable God appears. The tradition must choose its language carefully. Too much emotion risks change. Too much immutability risks distance. This tension has never been fully resolved. It has only been managed. Part 10. Why this matters. This is not a technical debate for philosophers alone. It shapes how believers imagine God's presence. A God who cannot be affected cannot be hurt by injustice. Cannot be wounded by indifference. Cannot be surprised by love. Some find comfort in that stability. Others feel a quiet absence. The question is not whether God cares. It is what caring means without change. If love never responds, is it still love as we understand it? Or must divine love be something so different that the word itself shifts meaning? Conclusion. An open question. Classical theism insists on two truths. God is immutable. God is love. Each claim is carefully defended. Each serves an important purpose. But when held together, they generate pressure. Perhaps divine love transcends human categories. Perhaps immutability needs reinterpretation. Perhaps love does not require vulnerability after all. Or perhaps something remains unresolved. If God cannot be affected, in what sense can God truly love? That question does not dissolve. It waits. Quietly.